America's Armada, near Iran, a dangerous turning point. The Middle East has once again become the center of global attention as reports emerge of a powerful American naval armada moving closer to Iranian waters. Aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, submarines, and support ships now form a visible symbol of U.S. military power in one of the world's most sensitive regions. For some observers, this is routine power projection. For others, it is a warning signal that the balance between deterrence and disaster is wearing dangerously thin. When fleets move and rivals watch each other through radar screens and satellites, history reminds us that even a single miscalculation can ignite a chain reaction far beyond anyone's control. At the heart of this tension lies a long and complicated relationship between the United States and Iran. Decades of mistrust, sanctions, proxy conflicts, and broken agreements have built a wall of suspicion so high that even defensive moves are interpreted as hostile acts. When America deploys an armada near Iran, Washington frames it as deterrence and protection of allies. Tehran, however, sees encirclement, intimidation, and preparation for possible strikes. This difference in perception is what makes the current situation especially dangerous. Power is not just about ships and missiles. It is about how intentions are read and misread in moments of crisis. The timing of this naval buildup matters. The Middle East is already under extreme pressure, with multiple conflicts overlapping and feeding into one another. Regional rivalries, unresolved wars, and fragile political systems create a volatile environment where external military presence acts like fuel near an open flame. The American Armada's arrival does not happen in isolation. It intersects with ongoing tensions involving Israel, Gulf states, armed non-state groups, and global powers watching closely from afar. Every actor in this drama understands that what happens in the Persian Gulf can reshape energy markets, alliance structures, and global security calculations. From the American perspective, naval dominance has always been a cornerstone of its foreign policy. Aircraft carriers are often described as floating cities, capable of projecting air power thousands of kilometers from U.S. shores. By positioning such assets near Iran, Washington sends a clear message. Any threat to U.S. forces, allies, or critical shipping routes will be met with overwhelming response. This show of strength is meant to deter aggression, reassure partners, and maintain freedom of navigation in waters vital to the global economy. Yet deterrence only works when both sides share a similar understanding of red lines, and history suggests that understanding is dangerously absent here. Iran's view of the American Armada is shaped by its own experiences. Sanctions have strained its economy, military pressure has increased, and diplomatic channels have often collapsed under political shifts in Washington and elsewhere. In this context, U.S. warships near Iranian territory are not seen as neutral guardians of international order, but as instruments of coercion. Iranian leaders frequently argue that their defensive measures are reactions, not provocations. When faced with foreign fleets near its borders, Tehran believes it must signal resolve to avoid appearing weak, a perception that could invite further pressure. This cycle of action and reaction creates a classic security dilemma. Each side insists it is acting defensively, yet each move makes the other feel less secure. A naval exercise becomes a rehearsal for war in the eyes of the opponent. A missile test becomes proof of hostile intent. The presence of an American armada amplifies this dilemma because it compresses decision-making time. When forces operate in close proximity, the margin for error shrinks dramatically. A radar misread, an accidental collision, or an unauthorized action by a local commander could escalate before diplomats even have time to pick up the phone. Beyond the immediate U.S.-Iran standoff, the regional implications are immense. Gulf states watch the situation with mixed feelings. On one hand, they rely on American military presence for security guarantees. On the other, they know that any open conflict would likely unfold in their neighborhood, threatening infrastructure, economies, and civilian lives. Shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz carry a significant portion of the world's oil and gas. Even the perception of instability can send shockwaves through global markets, raising prices and triggering political consequences far beyond the Middle East. Israel, too, factors heavily into this equation. Iranian influence across the region and concerns about advanced weapons programs have long placed Tehran and Tel Aviv on a collision course. An American armada near Iran is interpreted by some as indirect support for Israel's security stance. This further complicates matters, as Iran may feel pressured to demonstrate that it cannot be cornered or isolated. In such a climate, symbolic gestures, military parades, public warnings, and televised drills take on outsized importance, often replacing quiet diplomacy with loud posturing. Global powers outside the region are also paying close attention. For rivals of the United States, the situation offers both risk and opportunity. A confrontation could weaken American influence if it spirals out of control, but it could also destabilize markets and alliances in unpredictable ways. For allies, the concern is different. They fear being drawn into a conflict not of their choosing, one that could strain domestic politics and international commitments. Thus, The movement of an American armada near Iran becomes not just a regional event, but a global one. What makes this moment particularly Khatarnak, or dangerous, is the erosion of trust in communication channels. In earlier decades, even adversaries maintained back channels to manage crises. Today, those channels are fragile or absent. Political polarization, media pressure, and public rhetoric leave little room for compromise without appearing weak. Leaders on both sides must consider not only military calculations, but also domestic audiences, ideological narratives, and the fear of losing face. In such an environment, rational decision-making competes with emotional and symbolic considerations. As the Armada patrols near Iranian waters, the question is not simply whether war is imminent, but whether restraint can hold under sustained pressure. History shows that wars often begin not because leaders desire them, but because events slip beyond control. The concentration of military power raises the stakes of every interaction. Each maneuver is watched, analyzed, and often misunderstood. Each statement is dissected for hidden meaning. The line between deterrence and provocation becomes thinner with every passing day. Strategic calculations, what Washington wants, and why Tehran feels cornered. To understand why America's armada near Iran represents such a dangerous moment, it is essential to look beyond the ships themselves and into the strategic thinking driving both sides. Military deployments are never random. They are the physical expression of political objectives, threat perceptions, and long-term plans. For Washington, the movement of naval forces toward Iranian waters is about deterrence, leverage, and credibility. For Tehran, the same movement looks like encirclement, pressure, and a possible prelude to confrontation. These opposing interpretations sit at the core of the current crisis. From the American perspective, the Middle East remains a region where power must be visibly demonstrated. Despite years of debate about reducing U.S. involvement, Washington still sees itself as the ultimate guarantor of regional security. An armada near Iran serves several strategic purposes at once. First, it reassures allies that the United States is willing and able to protect them. In a region where trust is fragile and memories of sudden policy shifts linger, visible military presence speaks louder than diplomatic statements. Aircraft carriers and destroyers are tangible proof that commitments are not merely words. Second, the deployment is meant to deter Iran from actions that Washington considers destabilizing. These include threats to shipping lanes, attacks on regional partners, or rapid escalation through proxy groups. By positioning overwhelming force nearby, U.S. planners aim to raise the cost of any such actions to an unacceptable level. Deterrence theory assumes that rational actors will avoid moves that invite catastrophic retaliation. However, this assumption depends on shared definitions of what constitutes provocation and what responses are likely, an area where U.S. and Iranian views sharply diverge. Third, the Armada gives Washington strategic flexibility. Naval power is mobile, scalable, and reversible. Ships can move closer or farther away, escalate pressure or ease it, without the political baggage of permanent bases or ground deployments. This flexibility allows U.S. leaders to signal resolve while keeping options open. Yet flexibility for one side can look like unpredictability to the other. Tehran may see this freedom of movement as a sign that Washington is keeping military options deliberately ambiguous, which increases anxiety rather than reducing it. Iran's strategic outlook is shaped by a very different set of assumptions. Iranian leaders operate under the belief that the United States ultimately seeks to limit, weaken, or even overthrow their system. This belief has been reinforced over decades by sanctions, covert actions, and confrontational rhetoric. When an American armada appears near Iran's borders, it fits neatly into a narrative of external pressure designed to force submission. From Tehran's point of view, ignoring such a show of force would be dangerous, as it could signal vulnerability both to foreign rivals and domestic critics. Iran's response to perceived encirclement has long been asymmetrical. Lacking the ability to match the U.S. Navy ship for ship, Tehran focuses on strategies that complicate American calculations. These include developing missile capabilities, expanding influence through allied groups in the region, and emphasizing control over choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. The presence of a U.S. armada does not intimidate Iran into silence. Instead, it often motivates displays of resilience meant to show that pressure will be met, not absorbed. This dynamic creates a feedback loop of escalation. Each side believes it is reacting defensively, yet each reaction appears offensive to the other. When the U.S. deploys ships, Iran conducts military exercises or issues warnings. When Iran tests missiles or signals readiness, Washington increases surveillance or reinforces its naval posture. Over time, these cycles normalize higher levels of tension. What once would have been considered extraordinary becomes routine, reducing the psychological barrier to even more dangerous actions. Another critical factor is domestic politics on both sides. In the United States, leaders face pressure to appear strong and decisive, especially when adversaries challenge American influence. Political opponents and media scrutiny can turn restraint into a perceived weakness. Deploying an armada offers a visible, dramatic response that signals control and authority. At the same time, it avoids immediate combat, allowing leaders to claim firmness without crossing the threshold into open war. In Iran, domestic pressures work differently, but are no less intense. The leadership must balance economic strain, public dissatisfaction, and elite rivalries. Appearing passive in the face of American military pressure could undermine internal legitimacy. Hardline voices argue that only strength deters further coercion. As a result, Iranian decision-makers often feel compelled to respond symbolically or materially to U.S. moves, even when escalation carries significant risk. The regional environment further complicates these calculations. U.S. allies in the Gulf rely heavily on American protection, yet they also fear becoming targets in a U.S.-Iran confrontation. Their calls for reassurance can encourage Washington to maintain or increase its military presence. Iran, in turn, interprets this presence as part of a broader coalition aligned against it. Each additional actor adds layers of misunderstanding, as messages intended for one audience are received by many others, often with unintended interpretations. Communication gaps magnify these risks. In the absence of sustained diplomatic engagement, signals are sent through military actions rather than dialogue. Warships replace words and exercises substitute for negotiations. This militarization of communication is inherently dangerous, as it leaves little room for nuance. A maneuver meant as a warning can be seen as preparation for attack. Silence can be interpreted as plotting. Noise can be mistaken for panic. In such an atmosphere, even restraint can be misread. There's also the question of credibility. For Washington, failing to back up warnings with visible force could embolden not only Iran but other challengers elsewhere. Global strategy is interconnected. Actions in the Persian Gulf send messages far beyond the region. For Tehran, credibility is about survival. Demonstrating that pressure will not force compliance is central to its strategic identity. This clash of credibility narratives makes compromise politically costly for both sides. What truly makes the situation perilous is that neither side fully controls the environment. Military units operate under standing orders, but real-world situations are messy. Local commanders make rapid decisions based on incomplete information. Technological systems, no matter how advanced, are not immune to error. When forces operate close to each other, the probability of unintended incidents rises sharply. A small event can trigger large reactions if leaders feel their credibility or security is at stake. Thus, America's Armada near Iran is not merely a collection of ships. It is a concentration of strategic anxieties. Washington seeks deterrence and influence, while Tehran seeks security and autonomy. Both believe they are acting rationally. Both fear that backing down will invite greater danger. This mutual fear is what turns strategic calculation into a dangerous gamble. Regional shockwaves, allies, proxies, and the risk of a wider conflict. As America's Armada moves closer to Iran, the consequences ripple far beyond Washington and Tehran. The Middle East is not a simple chessboard with only two players. It is a crowded arena where states, militias, alliances, and rivalries overlap in complex ways. Any shift in military posture by a major power immediately affects regional calculations, often in ways that are difficult to predict or control. This is why the current situation is especially dangerous. It sits atop a web of tensions that can transform a limited standoff into a much wider confrontation. For U.S. allies in the Gulf, the presence of an American naval armada is both reassuring and unsettling. Countries that rely on U.S. security guarantees see these ships as a shield against potential threats. They interpret the deployment as proof that Washington remains committed to regional stability and to their defense. Yet beneath this reassurance lies deep anxiety. These states understand that if conflict erupts, their ports, energy facilities, and cities could become immediate targets. Proximity to Iran turns protection into vulnerability, making every show of strength a potential magnet for retaliation. Energy security amplifies these concerns. The Persian Gulf is one of the most vital arteries of the global economy, with oil and gas flows that affect prices worldwide. Any hint of instability near key shipping lanes sends shockwaves through markets. Insurance rates rise, shipping costs increase, and governments far removed from the region begin to feel domestic pressure. For regional actors, this economic dimension adds another layer of risk. Even without a single shot fired, heightened tension can inflict real financial damage, fueling public frustration and political instability. Israel's role adds further complexity. Long-standing hostility between Israel and Iran has turned the region into a shadow battlefield, with intelligence operations, cyber actions, and indirect clashes becoming routine. From Israel's perspective, Iran's regional influence and military capabilities pose an existential threat. An American armada near Iran is therefore seen by many Israeli strategists as a favorable development, one that could deter Iranian actions or limit its freedom of maneuver. Iran, however, views this alignment as confirmation that it faces a coordinated front determined to constrain its power. This perception drives Iran's reliance on proxy networks across the region. Groups aligned with Tehran operate in multiple theaters, creating strategic depth and deterrence. These actors provide Iran with options, short of direct confrontation, allowing it to respond to pressure in ways that are deniable or indirect. Yet proxies also introduce unpredictability. While aligned with Iranian interests, they have their own agendas, local dynamics, and internal pressures. In moments of high tension, actions by these groups can escalate conflicts even if central leadership prefers restraint. The United States understands this risk but struggles to manage it. Deterring a state is one challenge. Deterring a loose network of non-state actors is another entirely. When an American Armada signals resolve, it may discourage direct Iranian action while simultaneously provoking activity through proxies, seeking to prove relevance or loyalty. This creates a paradox where increased military presence reduces some risks while heightening others. The line between state responsibility and plausible deniability becomes blurred, complicating responses and increasing the chance of miscalculation. Regional powers not directly aligned with either side also face difficult choices. Some attempt to balance relationships, avoiding full commitment to either Washington or Tehran. For them, escalation threatens carefully managed diplomacy and economic ties. They fear being forced to choose sides in a confrontation that could undermine years of strategic positioning. As tension rises, neutrality becomes harder to maintain, and pressure mounts to align more clearly, further polarizing the region. The humanitarian dimension cannot be ignored. Past conflicts in the Middle East have shown how quickly civilians bear the cost of geopolitical struggles. Even limited military exchanges can disrupt daily life, displace populations, and strain already fragile infrastructure. Regional governments worry that unrest could spill over into domestic protests or instability. These fears influence their responses to American and Iranian actions, often pushing leaders to prioritize short-term security over long-term solutions. Global actors outside the region watch these developments closely. For some, the situation represents a test of American resolve and leadership. For others, it highlights the dangers of military-first approaches to complex political problems. Diplomatic efforts by external powers aim to prevent escalation, but their influence is constrained by mistrust and competing interests. Each major player seeks to protect its own strategic position, sometimes at the expense of collective stability. Media and public perception also play a powerful role. Dramatic images of warships, headlines warning of impending conflict, and constant commentary create a climate of fear and urgency. Leaders become prisoners of narratives that demand toughness and clarity. In such an environment, compromise is easily framed as weakness, while escalation is portrayed as decisive leadership. This pressure narrows the range of acceptable policy choices, making de-escalation politically risky, even when it is strategically wise. The most dangerous aspect of this regional dynamic is the risk of accidental escalation. With so many actors involved, control becomes diffuse. An incident involving a proxy group, a misinterpreted movement, or an unexpected clash at sea could trigger responses that rapidly outpace intentions. Alliances and commitments then pull additional players into the crisis, transforming a localized event into a regional emergency. History offers sobering lessons. Many major conflicts began with limited aims and confidence in control, only to expand through chains of obligation and reaction. In the current Middle Eastern context, where grievances run deep and trust is scarce, the margin for error is exceptionally thin. The presence of an American armada near Iran intensifies every existing fault line, increasing the probability that one of them will slip. This is why regional actors, even those who welcome U.S. power, quietly fear the consequences of prolonged tension. They understand that stability cannot be enforced indefinitely by military means alone. Without parallel diplomatic efforts, military deployments risk becoming self-fulfilling prophecies, creating the very confrontations they are meant to prevent. As the situation evolves, the region stands at a crossroads. Continued escalation could lock all sides into a cycle of reaction that ends in open conflict. Alternatively, recognition of shared risks could create space for restraint and dialogue, however fragile. In the final part, we will examine these possible futures, asking whether diplomacy can still prevail or whether the current trajectory points toward a confrontation that no one truly wants, but may be unable to avoid. The road ahead, between diplomacy and disaster. As America's armada remains positioned near Iran, the world is left watching a slow-moving but extremely high-stakes confrontation. The question dominating global discussions is no longer whether tensions exist, but where they are heading. History teaches that moments like these rarely stay frozen forever. They either ease through diplomacy and restraint, or they break through miscalculation and force. The current situation sits uncomfortably between these two paths, making the coming choices of leaders on all sides critically important. One possible future is de-escalation through cautious diplomacy. Even in the absence of full trust, limited communication can reduce the risk of catastrophe. Quiet back-channel talks, indirect messaging through intermediaries, and confidence-building measures have worked before, even among bitter rivals. Such efforts do not require friendship or agreement on every issue. They only require recognition that uncontrolled escalation would harm everyone involved. For Washington and Tehran, this would mean shifting from symbolic shows of strength to practical steps aimed at preventing accidents and misunderstandings. However, diplomacy faces serious obstacles. Years of broken agreements and failed negotiations have left deep scars. Each side doubts the other's sincerity, fearing that concessions will be exploited rather than reciprocated. Domestic politics further complicate the picture. Leaders who pursue dialogue risk accusations of weakness or betrayal. In highly polarized environments, even small gestures toward compromise can trigger backlash. As a result, the political cost of restraint often appears higher than the cost of continued pressure, even when logic suggests the opposite. Another possible trajectory is prolonged tension without open war. In this scenario, the American Armada remains in place. Iran continues to signal defiance, and the region lives under constant strain. Incidents occur, but are carefully managed to avoid full escalation. This uneasy balance may appear stable on the surface, but it carries long-term risks. Constant military readiness drains resources, heightens stress, and normalizes confrontation. Over time, the probability of a serious incident increases as fatigue, overconfidence, or technological failure erode caution. The most dangerous path is a sudden slide into conflict triggered by a single event. A misinterpreted maneuver, a clash involving regional proxies, or an accident at sea could force leaders into rapid decisions under intense pressure. In such moments, there is little time for reflection or diplomacy. Pride, fear, and the desire to maintain credibility can override restraint. What begins as a limited exchange could expand quickly, drawing in allies and destabilizing the entire region. No side may intend such an outcome, yet all could become trapped by it. The global consequences of open conflict would be severe. Energy markets would react instantly, affecting economies worldwide. Shipping disruptions would ripple through supply chains already under strain. Financial markets would respond with volatility, and governments far from the Middle East would face domestic pressure to respond. Humanitarian costs would be immense, with civilians once again caught in the crossfire of geopolitical rivalries. These risks are well understood by policymakers, yet understanding alone does not guarantee prevention. One of the key questions is whether deterrence can continue to function without tipping into provocation. Deterrence relies on clarity, predictability, and communication. When these elements erode, military strength loses its stabilizing effect. The presence of an American armada near Iran may deter certain actions, but it also raises the emotional temperature of every interaction. Over time, this constant pressure can distort decision-making, making leaders more reactive and less strategic. Technology adds another layer of uncertainty. Modern military systems operate at incredible speed, compressing the time available for human judgment. Automated alerts, rapid response protocols, and cyber vulnerabilities increase the risk that errors will escalate before they can be corrected. In such an environment, restraint requires not only political will, but also robust safeguards and clear rules of engagement. Without them, even well-intentioned forces can become catalysts for disaster. Despite these dangers, there remains a narrow window for a different outcome. Regional actors, global powers, and international institutions all have roles to play in encouraging restraint. Confidence-building measures, such as agreements on naval conduct or communication hotlines, can reduce the risk of accidents. Economic incentives and diplomatic engagement can offer alternatives to confrontation. None of these solutions are easy, and none guarantee success, but the absence of effort guarantees failure. Ultimately, the situation reflects a deeper challenge in international politics: how to manage rivalry without surrendering to conflict. The American Armada near Iran symbolizes both power and vulnerability. It demonstrates strength, yet it also reveals how close the world remains to crisis. Iran's defiance reflects a desire for security and autonomy, yet it also underscores the limits of resistance in a system dominated by military might. Between these positions lies a fragile space where careful choices can still make a difference. The future will be shaped not only by grand strategies, but by everyday decisions: how commanders interpret orders, how leaders phrase statements, how media frames events, and how publics respond. In moments of tension, restraint often feels unsatisfying and invisible, while force appears decisive and clear. Yet history repeatedly shows that true leadership lies in preventing wars that never make headlines, rather than winning those that do. As the world watches America's armada near Iran, one truth stands out. This is not merely a regional issue or a temporary standoff. It is a test of whether global politics can adapt to an era where power is immense, but the cost of its misuse is even greater. The coming weeks and months will reveal whether caution and diplomacy can still prevail, or whether momentum and mistrust will push events beyond control. If you found this analysis insightful and want more deep dive stories on global power, hidden strategies, and world-shaping events, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you clearer perspectives on the forces shaping our world